Hi there, welcome to our Bio24 lecture on birth control. First, before we go over different types of birth control, I want to cover parts of the female sexual reproductive organs. I'm not really going to talk too much about the male reproductive organs because there's not much that's involved in birth control methods. But with the female reproductive system, there's a lot that's involved. And that's because there's really only one option for men, whereas there's many options for women. Here's the female reproductive system. There are a few important features that I want to go over as it will pertain to future portions of this lecture. The female reproductive system consists of two primary reproductive structures, the ovaries, located here and here in the abdomen. The ovaries are connected to the uterus by fallopian tubes. Fallopian tubes, importantly, are where fertilization occurs. So just to give you a sense as to how this would happen, the penis goes into the vagina here and deposits the sperm inside the vagina. The sperm then have to travel up through this area, which is the opening to the uterus, called the cervix, and then they have to swim all the way up the uterus, figure out which direction to go by detecting chemical signals from the egg, and then move up into the fallopian tube, and in the fallopian tube they'll find the egg and fertilize the egg there. Once the egg is fertilized, it then takes 3 to 5 days for that fertilized egg to move down into the uterus and implant into the uterine wall. It's only then a woman is considered pregnant. At this point, the fertilized egg has become a cluster of cells. So in the 3 to 5 days that it takes for it to move down the fallopian tube and into the uterus, the cell is dividing into a cluster of cells. The embryo then grows into fetus here, and eventually, when the time is right, will cause the cervix to dilate. This area will open, and the baby will be born through the birth canal or vagina. So the oocytes are in fact immature eggs. And so when I refer to oocytes in this lecture, it's basically the same thing as an egg as far as our understanding of it is concerned. The oocytes or eggs are produced in the ovaries and then released into the fallopian tube. Now, all of this is regulated by two different types of hormones. The first set of hormones I want to cover very briefly are LH and FSH. These stand for luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. These are produced in the brain and sent from the pituitary gland in the brain down all the way to the ovaries in the abdomen through the bloodstream. Once a month, the luteinizing hormone, or LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, are released by the pituitary gland and lead to ovulation in the ovaries, or the release of a single oocyte. The rest of the month, these two hormones are not produced at all in the brain, or produced in very low amounts. What I just referred to, which is the release of a single oocyte or egg, is referred to as the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle is regulated by LH and FSH produced from the brain, and regulate the release of a single oocyte from one of the ovaries once a month. However, there's something totally different that's happening in your ovaries that's regulating your uterus. And these two hormones are what we're going to be talking primarily about later in this chapter. That's estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone are produced in the ovaries, and they are sent from the ovaries to the uterus. In the uterus, they are going to cause the uterine lining, the endometrial layer, to build up and then shed. Now, what you can see from this graph, and this is a little complicated, but it is important to remember because when we go over many of the female birth control methods, those female birth control methods, many of them are governed by these two hormones. But what you'll notice is that when estrogen and progesterone are both low in the body, that's going to cause shedding of the uterine lining. This essentially is your period, when you have menstruation. So the uterine cycle is measured as the first day of the uterine cycle is the first day of your period. And again, that's when estrogen and progesterone are both low. You have your period for about 5 to 7 days, and then after that, estrogen starts to increase. The estrogen production in the ovaries is sensed by the uterus, and what you'll notice is that as the estrogen increases, so does the uterine lining. This rebuilding of the uterine lining is to prepare the uterus for a possible fertilized egg for the next month. Progesterone, as you see, remains low. Then, timed with the ovarian cycle, when LH and FSH are released and the ovary is signaled to release, estrogen decreases and progesterone increases. So they sort of switch or swap. This happens at day 14. So this is exactly in the middle of your uterine cycle. The uterine lining remains high at this point and maybe builds a little bit, but basically just maintains itself when progesterone is high and estrogen is low. As you can see here, estrogen starts to build up again. So we have high progesterone and high estrogen until both of these hormones plummet again. And when those hormones plummet, you get shedding of the uterine lining and your period again. Right? So again, these hormones are released by the ovaries and cause an increase and shedding of the uterine lining or menstruation. Now, we're going to begin talking about birth control. And birth control has a couple of different sort of data points that we're going to be talking about. Failure rates for birth control are given as the number of women out of 100 that become pregnant using that birth control method in 1 year. So out of 100 women that use that birth control method in 1 year, how many of them become pregnant? For comparison, if you are trying to become pregnant and you expressly have sex when you know you are ovulating, out of 100 women who are doing that in a year, in a full year, only 85% of them get pregnant. So this isn't like 100% that we're comparing it to. In fact, only 85% of couples are fertile and get pregnant in a year. The first one we're going to talk about is the male condom. Now, the male condom is often made of latex, but there are other options like polyurethane, a type of plastic, and sheepskin. Now, the latex is the most common. The polyurethane, though, is produced for individuals who are allergic to latex. The important thing to remember with the different options is that while latex and polyurethane act as a prophylactic and birth control, the sheepskin version only acts as birth control. Now, what's the difference? The male condom, if made of latex and polyurethane, is really the only option out of all of them that we're going to talk about in this lecture that's both a prophylactic and birth control. Everything else is just birth control. A prophylactic is a technique or method that is used to decrease the possibility of getting an STI or sexually transmitted infection. Sheepskin condoms don't do this. They block the passage of sperm, but they do not block the passage of bacteria and viruses that can cause sexually transmitted infections. The latex and polyurethane, though, do. The way that this works is that the condom itself is placed over an erect penis, which physically blocks the passage of sperm from the penis into the vagina. The failure rate of the male condom is 11%, and that's for practical or real failure rates, effective failure rates, and not theoretical failure rates. Now, the difference is that the theoretical failure rate of the condom is actually more like 1 or 2%. But That's if it's used perfectly every time. Most people don't use the condom perfectly every time. Instead, they will sometimes put the condom on after already beginning intercourse, or the condom may break due to improper sizing. And as a result, the failure rate increases to 11%. There are not many risks for use of male condoms. The risks that do exist include irritation, some allergic reactions, though these are not very common with the polyurethane and sheepskin varieties. And other than abstinence, the latex condoms are, again, the best protection against STIs, or sexually transmitted infections. Now, we can also talk a little bit about the female condom, which is not an effective method of birth control. And that's because its failure rate is 21%. So 1 out of 5 women that use this as an exclusive method of birth control in 1 year get pregnant. And so it's not really considered effective by the CDC. It's made of polyurethane, or that plastic, and it's inserted into the vagina prior to sexual intercourse. Risks of this are irritation and minor risk of allergies. But there's also not a lot of STD protection. It's not as effective as the male condom for STI protection or STD protection. Similarly, the diaphragm is also not really considered very effective. It's, again, a physical barrier, just like everything else we've talked about. This is a dome-shaped rubber disc that sits at the entrance of the uterus, basically covering the cervix. Again, this blocks sperm from entering the uterus and reaching the oocyte or egg. The failure rate of this is, again, 17%, so almost 1 out of every 5 women that use this exclusively end up getting pregnant in 1 year. Again, there's a risk of irritation and allergies, but there's also a risk of urinary tract infections and toxic shock syndrome because you reuse these. So diaphragms are measured by a doctor, and you purchase one, and then you remove it when you're done and clean it and then reuse it. But since you're not sterilizing it, since it's not totally brand new when you use it, it can still have some microbes on there that can lead to urinary tract infections or toxic shock syndrome. There's also no protection against STIs. But what is nice about it is that it can be left in place for 24 hours. So you don't have to interrupt intercourse in order to place it in. You can place it in on the day that you think that you might be having sexual intercourse, and then worry about it later. And again, with this one, you need to visit a doctor. So you do need a prescription because they need to fit it to your body. There's also an option of using spermicides alone, but again, these are really not very effective. The CDC, again, does not recommend using spermicide alone because the failure rate of just using spermicide is anywhere from 20 to 50%. So much higher than what we've seen with some of these others, like female condoms and the diaphragm. There is, of course, a risk of irritation and allergies and urinary tract infections because of application. And there's no protection against STIs because all these things do is kill sperm. They don't do anything to the bacteria or viruses that can cause infections. What is really effective, but only, again, useful for birth control, is hormonal birth control methods that are exclusively used by women these days. So in our next section, we're going to talk about that.